Ultron, who were also responsible for the GBA port of R-Type 3, Pocky and Rocky with Becky, and a ton of other games. Like, what? For the PlayStation? No wonder why this game is great. Oh.
Man, the editing is so good in this video.
And that direction is why Donkey Kong Country 2 stands head and shoulders above its predecessor.
Man, post-Network stuff's gotten really good lately, too.
Hey guys, sorry for the long wait on this one.
Everyone's been doing so well with their videos lately. I'm finally glad they're getting the recognition they deserve. I wonder how I'm doing in comparison.
Left queen. Oh well. That's not what I meant when I said I wanted my daughter to become a queen.
Comments usually cheer me up. At what point do I consider this a failure? I tried, but I'm just not good enough. I guess I got one more video to work on, then that'll be it. I'm done with the channel. It's over. Might as well shill. Join the dollar No one's gonna believe I shave. I'm not afraid to admit that there are a lot of video games that have broken my heart. I can't play through Snake Eater without crying. Certain scenes in Silent Hill 2 will cause me to choke up, and I've openly wept at the end of Crisis Core, To the Moon, Majora's Mask, Red Dead Redemption, Shadow of the Colossus. There are a lot of heart-wrenching stories in video games, but to me, there's no story that is sadder than Okami. Okami is considered to be one of the greatest games ever made. It was a critical success by reviewers, getting praise and awards, including multiple Game of the Year awards. While the game certainly had its share of flaws, such as the slow pacing and questionable choice of text sounds, Okami might be the closest thing to a perfectly designed game. It was the magnum opus of Clover Studios, a company that was set to change the perceptions of the gaming industry. And the success of Okami might have changed the concept of AAA development as we know it today. Which is why it breaks my heart every time I think of Okami's legacy. Selling only 250,000 units the year it was released, and following lackluster sales from the Wii port, Okami was given one other award. The least commercially successful winner of a Game of the Year award in the Guinness Book of World Records with only 600,000 units sold. What was the magnum opus of Clover Studios ended up being its swan song, which after Okami's release resulted in Capcom closing the company and the departure of 3 of Capcom's most renowned employees. This is Design Documentaries, an in-depth look at a game's development and design. And with a heavy heart, today we're looking at Clover Studios' Okami, the best game that was never played. We already talked about Clover Studios once before in my God Hand video, but as a brief recap, Clover Studios was a second-party development studio created by Capcom as a way of easing growing tensions between themselves and their designers, notably Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil 1 and 4 fame, Hideki Kamiya, who directed Resident Evil 2 and later Bayonetta, and Atsushi Inaba, who produced games like Steel Battalion and Phoenix Wright. Capcom had forced the studio to make something like half a dozen sequels for Beautiful Joe, but the team was finally given the green light to work on original IP. Shinji Mikami had started work on God Hand, his ball-bustingly difficult 3D brawler, but during this time, the other half of Clover was working on Hideki Kamiya's project, a game about a white wolf in nature, Okami. It's interesting to note, God Hand could be considered a game where Mikami had his most freedom. It was his game to do whatever he wanted with it, which resulted in a challenging game with a focus on humor that ends up being a love letter to the games and anime that inspired it. Okami, on the other hand, was almost the opposite. It was Kamiya showing a lot of temperance. Hideki Kamiya is known for his incredibly blunt personality, which, if he ends up seeing this video, could just as easily block me on Twitter as likely as he is to retweet it. Actually, now that I think about it, he might just do both. But with his fiery personality comes a focus on intense action and highly stylistic combat that at this point is pretty much synonymous with Hideki Kamiya. Games like Devil May Cry, The Wonderful 101, and Bayonetta are often what is associated with his work as vice president for Platinum Games. Okami, on the other hand, is almost anything but that. While the combat itself does share some DNA from Hideki Kamiya's other titles, the game is not what you would be expecting coming from a Kamiya game. Traveling point to point isn't about fighting your way through a ton of enemies, but rather about exploration through large overworlds with very little combat. There's a heavy focus on narrative and world building, pulling heavily from Japanese legends and myths. The best way to describe everything about Okami is deliberate. And this was intentional. Despite the various issues that were happening at Capcom with development, mainly the growing frustration with development teams for having to release sequel after sequel, Hideki Kamiya had a lot of freedom in the company. Not necessarily afforded to him by Capcom per se, but rather his immediate boss, Shinji Mikami. Kamiya had joined Capcom as a planner and had directly worked with Mikami as a system planner for Resident Evil. But he was quickly brought on as a director for the sequel to Resident Evil, a game which Kamiya had completely screwed up, according to him. Though probably not the Resident Evil 2 you're thinking of, but rather the unreleased beta version of Resident Evil 2, what we know as Resident Evil 1.5. During an interview with Satoru Iwata, Kamiya himself had stated, "I messed up in a big way. As a result of saying okay to everything that came out, it turned out horrible. We had to scrap what we spent a year and a half making. I felt like people were staring at me in the company cafeteria and saying, 'That's him! That's the guy that ruined Resident Evil 2!' It was a shock and very hard." However, rather than punish Kamiya, Mikami had actually defended him and allowed him to continue work on the project because he knew Kamiya had learned from his mistakes. Mikami would also go to bat for Kamiya years later during the development of Resident Evil 4. Mikami had asked Kamiya to make another Resident Evil successor. He had approached him and said, "Make the game that you want. You don't have to worry about it being a horror game. You can do it however you like." Which, for an IP as big as Resident Evil, that was a huge grant. Kamiya took this opportunity to make a more stylistic, action-focused game. As it developed, it became clear that the game wasn't at all like a traditional Resident Evil. So Mikami had approached Capcom about making it a new IP, which Capcom initially refused because they have a severe allergic reaction to anything not a sequel. But Mikami kept pressing for 3 months and eventually succeeded. That initial Resident Evil 4 prototype had become Devil May Cry. So when Kamiya had started his first project within Clover Studios, rather than make a game he was typically known for, he wanted the first original IP to be something that everyone could enjoy and associate with the studio. The concept of Okami was pitched as a way for Kamiya to put himself to the side. He had hoped that, I wiped away the image people have of me as, oh, that guy makes the Devil May Cry and Beautiful Joe games. However, the development of Okami wasn't as straightforward as you might expect. The very first design of Okami was in a trailer called the Okami Prototype, showing a realistic white wolf running as plants sprouted behind it. It didn't feature the cel-shaded graphics that the game would be known for. It didn't feature any sort of gameplay. Not even the name was the same as the final version. And that's because, really, this trailer was all Okami was at the time. And I don't mean that Clover Studios only got that far in development. I mean, conceptually, this is the only thing that Kamiya had thought of so far. When I first started talking about it with Inaba, the only starting point we had for Okami was a game that depicted a lot of nature. Once we settled down from that, we realized we had no idea what this game was supposed to be like. We had no story, no gameplay system. To make a game out of this video, we had to come up with all sorts of rules. But I also had to keep the original concept, depicting the splendor of nature, central in people's minds. That all stemmed from Kamiya being homesick for a more rural life after moving from the Nagano prefecture to the city, and the idea of using a wolf came from a pet that Kamiya once had growing up. The art style developed as sort of a happy little accident, when character designer Takayasu Sawaki had drawn the concept of Amaterasu in the traditional Suma-e style of art. It was at this point that Kamiya had approached Atsushi Inaba about changing the entire game to this art style. However, they still didn't quite know what to do with the game itself. They had messed around with the idea of making it a simulation style game where you created trees and built roads, but according to Kamiya, it was total garbage. Development had floundered for a while, until an agitated Inaba had enough and reportedly blew up on his staff demanding, "What are you gonna do about this game?" So several of the staff had spent a long weekend working trying to figure out the core concepts. On the first day they had nothing. They had this concept of a wolf goddess but didn't know what she could do. Then one of the staff members said something that changed the entire concept of the game. She can do anything. It was then that Kamiya had the idea of being able to use the art style as part of the game's mechanics. If you draw a tree appears. So what if you drew the trajectory of the wind and the wind blew? It was at that point that Okami as we know it was officially born. Going off of this, the development had just started to fall into place. The idea of vast, large areas and exploring nature was inspired by Legend of Zelda. And from that came borrowing other elements as well. Hideki Kamiya had stated, "No one said, hey, we're gonna make a Zelda game, but if there were no Zelda, there would be no Okami." The final result was a game that was a large critical success for Clover Studios. It had very high review scores, including a 39 from Famitsu. It had won several awards such as Best Story, Best Adventure Game, Best Artistic Design, Best Innovative Design, accumulating into several Game of the Year awards. It even won grand prize at the Japanese Media Arts Festival, beating out games like Final Fantasy XII, The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and Rockstar's Bully. And a reminder, this was the same year Nintendo had released Twilight Princess. Okami had managed to out-Zelda The Legend of Zelda that year, in a game that featured their own wolf mechanic. That's not bad for a game that was effectively put together at the last minute to please an angry boss. But that's part of Hideki Kamiya's style. In fact, there's a similar story. That's how he designed Beautiful Joe under the exact same circumstances. The surprising thing about Okami isn't the fact that it's a good game, or even the fact that it was well designed. What's surprising is how well designed it is. When you hear about good game design, most of the time it's praising how certain game mechanics teach you how to play the game. For example, the regain system in Bloodborne allows you to get your health back after you've been hit. What's interesting about this is how it promotes the concept of rewarding you for a more aggressive playstyle, which differentiates itself from Dark Souls' tendency to reward you for playing more methodically and defensive. And that makes sense because Bloodborne's combat overall is more action and reflex based. It's a mechanic that's cohesive to the overall gameplay. But it's not just mechanics though. Nearly every aspect of a game can be part of its design. Like in Tetris, getting a Tetris is worth 4 times as many points as it is clearing 3 lines, 12 times as much as clearing 2 lines, and 30 times as much as clearing a single line. While points in Tetris are the point of the game, you don't really have a chance to look at the score while playing. So instead, Tetris uses its sound design to reward you. Not a Tetris? A Tetris. The noise is different, so if it's different, it must be important. Now you're being taught to play a riskier, more rewarding game. And game design doesn't even have to be about the gameplay. Resident Evil uses its design and mechanics to match the narrative tone, where Psycho Mantis uses both your memory card and your controller to tell its story. However, in terms of game design, Okami is on a completely different plane of existence. I say this with very little hyperbole. Okami might be one of the best designed games ever made. Not for the fact that its mechanics were revolutionary or unique. Mechanically, the game is a shameless copy of the Zelda formula, but rather the fact that every design element in Okami is connected to each other in some way. From its core mechanic to the story, its art style and music, working together in complete harmony with each other. I would be here all day if I tried to explain every detail of Okami's design. There's just simply so much out there I cannot do justice in one video. So for the sake of brevity, let me just point out a few of Okami's designs, and more importantly, how it all fits together. Okami starts off with what might be its biggest flaw against it, its opening cutscene. It's a 15-minute long exposition about the game's backstory that's almost all tell and no show, filled with names that have no meaning to you, and worst of all, the entire cutscene is unskippable. If you watched my building character on RPG intros, you can probably take a guess where I personally stand on this.
Also, I swear part 3 will eventually happen. I'm really sorry.
And I guess now would be a good time to remind you that I'm not saying Okami is a perfect game by any means. However, even this opening cutscene isn't without merit. This cutscene is actually a retelling of the Japanese legend of Susanoo and Yamato no Orochi. Though Western audiences might not be familiar with it, the game is heavily based on Japanese mythology. And it's already informed us that that's not only the narrative, but also the thematic tone, which is also heavily hinted at by how the game tells its story. See, it's not just showing you a cutscene using the in-game models, but rather a drawn image on a paper scroll. Not only showing that in a more historical context, but also hinting at a connection we're gonna mention later. And for better or for worse, Okami is a very slow-paced and narrative-focused experience. So this cutscene is genuinely accurate to the experience you're gonna find in a game, basically providing a litmus test if this is a game you'll enjoy or not, something that's fairly important within the first couple of minutes of a game. But during the second part of the cutscene is when you're introduced to the main characters, namely the goddess of the sun Amaterasu and Isun. And by now you will have noticed Okami's most distinguishing feature, the cel-shaded art style. Cel-shading was sort of a fad at the time, introduced by Sega's Jet Set Radio in the year 2000, and later popularized by The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker and Clover's own Beautiful Joe. However, Okami didn't just use cel-shading because it was popular, but instead used it to emulate the traditional Japanese art style Suma-e, or black ink painting. Each model has a color that's similar to watercoloring, and it has these thick, dark lines surrounding it. Combining this with the heavy rice paper filter that overlays the entire game gives Okami a beautiful yet very distinctive look. Since it's an art style that would have been prevalent in the historical era of Japan, now the game's narrative and art style are connected. And that's not even going into the traditional Japanese soundtrack backing all of this. Not only that, but you quickly learn that the art style is also a game mechanic. Outside of the basic attacks, moving, and jumping, almost everything is done with the celestial brush. You pull up this overlay that mutes the color but shows the thick, heavy outlines. By drawing certain symbols on this overlay, you create effects. Drawing a bomb-like symbol causes a bomb to appear to blow up walls, or drawing a circle in the sky brings out the sun. And while that's a neat little mechanic, what's really amazing about it is the narrative implication. You aren't just activating an item, but rather you're bringing it into existence by drawing it on the paper. And you're able to do that because you're a goddess. Also, by the way, if you're paying attention to the opening cutscene, not only did it show you an example of the mechanics, but it also gave you a hint on how to defeat one of the game's main bosses. Oh, and I'm not done yet. I'm just getting started. So yes, to make things clear, Okami shamelessly steals a lot of the core mechanics from the 3D Legend of Zelda series. Overworld exploration, dungeons, how to use your tools to solve puzzles and defeat bosses. Comparisons between the two are ultimately unavoidable. But hey, listen, if you're gonna copy a formula, The Legend of Zelda certainly isn't a bad one to copy. However, what makes Okami different is how it utilizes those mechanics. In The Legend of Zelda, everything is based around your tools, but due to the limitations of your inventory, mainly the buttons on the controller, most dungeons and fights only require you to use a few at a time. However, with Okami you have no limitation. You can draw anything at any given time. So Okami's gameplay actually ends up having what would be more complex dungeons or combat without having to fetch that item you need. Okami really has a different goal than your typical Zelda though. There isn't a great emphasis on dungeon exploration or puzzle solving, and there isn't even a heavy focus on combat like you would expect from a Okami title. Instead, the focus of Okami is about exploring and enjoying nature. The main narrative of Okami isn't so much that there is this big evil that you need to stop, but rather that you need to restore the world. So a lot of the game involves traveling to areas and bringing back life to the world. And the game shows this in the art style again, having corrupted areas that are dark and murky and often without color, and restoring them rewards you with a brilliant shower of colors. Doing so also rewards you with a large amount of praise, which functions as experience points that make you more powerful. Which, by the way, makes sense narratively considering you're a goddess who's empowered by people's belief in her. So the reason that you're so weak is due to the fact you've been gone for 100 years, and people have lost faith. And by performing these acts of restoring nature, providing food for the many animals, and generally solving the world's issues, you are renewing the people's faith in the gods, which mechanically makes you stronger. In the end though, the game isn't really about you at all, but rather the lives you influence. Characters you meet often have a weakness or character flaw, but as you subtly influence the world around them, you see them progress into stronger and better people. For example, there is the scene in which the village elder seeks to restore the town's cherry blossom tree using a ritual. However, as he does the ritual, it's up to you to use the celestial brush to cause it to bloom. At first it seems like it's just an interesting way to restore the tree in a minigame, but if you think about it, you realize that you're not causing the tree to bloom, but you're also answering his prayers. Like a goddess. Also, almost all your powers can be used to help or just mess with the villagers, which, not surprisingly, is the root of Japanese mythology, which is how the whole thing started to begin with. And alright, we went through a lot of stuff here, so let's reiterate this a little bit. We have a narrative that's focused on mythology that inspired an art style that's used as a game mechanic that thematically matches the narrative tone of the game, which is used throughout the game to match a historical context which is rooted in the culture the game takes place, and by doing so makes you, as the player, the actual thing it's based on. And if that wasn't enough, the entire time you're playing as a wolf goddess who can attack enemies by peeing and pooping on them. Holy crap. So while it might not be perfect, the design of Okami is nothing short of incredible. Everything just works so well together and it's so painstakingly designed. There really is so much to praise about the game that you can literally take any section of the game and have something to talk about. Which is why it breaks my heart. Okami was such a well-designed game, but it ultimately ended being a commercial failure. Not once, but twice. So how the hell did Okami fail? As mentioned before, despite Okami's critical success, it sold poorly and was considered a commercial failure. To such a great extent, it holds the world record of least commercially successful winner of a Game of the Year award. And that was after 2 console releases, with the original on the PS2 and the Wii port released 2 years later in 2008. And these were consoles with huge install bases, and it was released at a budget price of $40, with Japan even having a greatest hits version of the game that brought it down to an even lower price. Though typically greatest hits versions were designed for games that sold over 400,000 copies. But since Okami didn't come anywhere close to those numbers, one has to wonder if Capcom was just trying to get rid of backstock. One of the producers at Capcom stated that it was simply on the wrong console at the wrong time. According to Motohide Ishiro, I can't comment officially, but personally speaking, I think a lot of it had to do with announcements for new consoles. That was overshadowing any other game news at the time. Which is true, in 2006 the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Wii had all been released, meaning Okami was well into the last generation of consoles. But while that makes sense for the PS2 release, the Wii sales were also poor, selling only 250,000 copies, so it's hard to say if that was the direct cause of Okami's failure. Another theory is perhaps Okami was just too much of a culture shock to players outside of Japan. I mean, the game is distinctly Japanese, focusing on Japanese mythology and culture, so maybe it just didn't resonate with Western audiences. But actually, there is a good chance that Okami had done better in the West. Going by the 600,000 units reported by the Guinness Book of World Records, 200,000 were reported for the North American PlayStation 2 sales, and another 280,000 were for the North American and European Wii port. Meaning Okami most likely sold worse in Japan, with less than 200,000 units sold for both the PlayStation 2 and the Wii. So maybe it was due to lack of name recognition. The game had little to no official marketing. The most I could find was a Japanese commercial. I couldn't even find a scan of a print ad to show you. So maybe Capcom just sent the game out to fail. After all, even before Okami's success or failure in the West, the decision to close Clover Studios was already made. Okami could have suffered the same fate as God Hand, in being a game they simply had no investment in its success or failure. But even then, there are questions. How exactly do we explain the HD releases, going as far as including Amaterasu in Marvel vs. Capcom 3? Capcom even made a sequel in Okamiden for the DS, which is, well, not a great game, but fairly serviceable. And this was back when Capcom had a policy of not making sequels unless the original game did well. For all intents and purposes, it seemed like Capcom really wanted Okami to succeed, despite its low sales. And a reminder, this is a company that refused to give us Mega Man Legends 3. It could also be that Okami, for all its amazingly wonderful designs, just wasn't a game that many people enjoyed. Game design is mostly objective. You can pull it apart, you can see what makes it work and how it functions. A game can be incredibly well designed, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a game that relates to people. Fun is almost entirely subjective and can be completely independent of its design. With game design, you can talk about what elements made the game fun, but their inclusion or exclusion will have little to do with the actual enjoyment you can derive from it. Two people can play a game like Stardew Valley and one person could love it and another could hate it, and honestly, neither of those feelings are wrong. To me, Okami is a work of art. I deeply respect and appreciate its design, but there are games I enjoyed more that are objectively worse in their design, like God Hand, for example. God Hand is a dumb game, and I don't mean that in a negative way.
This is dumb.
God Hand isn't trying to be anything more than a basic game. There was nowhere near as much polish or thought put into it. The story is completely throwaway, the graphics aren't all that great. Really, the only thing about God Hand that makes it interesting is its unique combat. But I played it dozens of times, and for as much as I love Okami from a design standpoint, I never really felt compelled to finish it until I made this video. But then again, at least Okami sold more copies than God Hand, so that could be just me. The most likely reason Okami failed is, well, there could be no reason. The truth is, a game can fail for any reason, and most times it can simply be no reason at all. Though we tend to cling to indie success stories like Undertale, Stardew Valley, or Sanctuary RPG, where an underdog developer went against all odds to create the game that they wanted to make and won through perseverance and passion. For every story like that, there are hundreds of stories of failure that are never heard. There is no known statistic, but many believe it's a fraction of 1% of games that are released that are financially successful. And that success isn't even an indicator of quality. Legitimately terrible games can be more successful than games that are by all means objectively better. We live in a world where Superman 64 sold better than Okami. Superman 64 sold better than Okami. I have no mouth and I must scream. That doesn't strictly apply to video games either. It can happen with any medium. Books, music, movies, even YouTube channels. Nothing is promised success. It's an unfortunate truth, one that might even be disheartening. No one wants to hear that you can put in all your effort and do everything right and still fail. By every right, Okami deserved to have success, and the fact that it didn't, it's painful to think about. I'm gonna be real with you. It's something I personally struggle with. To know I can put everything I have into a video, and there's a good chance that people won't like it or not even see it. I'm not quite sure how to cope with that. But I think Hideki Kamiya did know how.
さっきも言ったんですけど、その強迫観念というか怖いんですよね。とにかくね、新しいゲームを作っていきたいんですけど、まあその必ずしも成功するとも限らないですしね。まあそれでもやっぱり気持ちとしてはチャレンジングなことはしていきたいですし。でまあ、幸いそういうことをさせてもらえるいい環境にあるんで、まあ、このまま頑張っていきたいですね。
And that was exactly what Hideki Kamiya did. Despite the failure of Okami, Kamiya didn't stop making games. After his departure from Clover Studios, Kamiya, Inaba, and Mikami founded Seed Inc., which would later go on to become Platinum Games, with Kamiya himself directing Bayonetta and The Wonderful 101. It was games like these that had Platinum Games become a household name, and it allowed the studio to create hits like Metal Gear Revengeance and Nier Automata, and it's what fulfilled Kamiya's dream of being involved with the new Star Fox game. And even after the initial failure of Okami, it seemed to have eventually got the recognition it deserved. With an HD release on the PS3 and later to the PS4, Xbox One, and Steam, according to the Capcom investment relations site, they proudly display Okami with 2 million units sold. While still not quite the numbers I feel it deserves, it's nice to know that Okami ultimately didn't end up a forgotten gem. It might even be considered a commercial success now. And it's fitting that Okami was such a complete game, because probably the most important thing was a lesson taught by Okami itself. As you watch the credits of the game, you're treated to the ending song Reset by Ayaka Hirahara. It's a beautiful song, but almost ironically, it doesn't really seem to have anything to do with Okami's narrative. The translated lyrics suggest the song is about seeing something beautiful but having it fade away, never to be seen again, which isn't fully touched on in Okami's story. But considering Hideki Kamiya called the sequence the emotion of the development team, it suggests that this ending song might have been a more personal anthem to Clover Studios. The lyrics tell of a scattering of flower petals, most likely from a cherry tree that is later referenced in the song, the wind telling them it would be the last time. And I can't really help but associate that with the idea of Capcom closing Clover Studios. It goes on to mention that change is ultimately inevitable, just as the seasons will change, so there's no need to worry about it. But that doesn't really help with the constant cycle of sadness at the revelation of losing something irrevocably, and that longing of just being able to go back and revisit those moments one more time, if nothing else other than just to say a proper goodbye to it. But despite that sadness and regret, also comes the idea that the memories you have are still there, and you can still return to them. That despite of it, that pain is only from that one experience itself, and that by moving forward, you're no longer dwelling on it anymore. That despite the pain, you need to keep singing, or trying, or searching for the answers. It repeats the lyric of talking about revisiting those memories and holding on to them, but the first line is different. Not showing regret and wanting to say goodbye to that moment, but reaching across time as if you're able to go back to that moment and tell yourself everything is going to be alright. It ends with the line, "Reset the sadness," with the implication that it's not about having a memory filled with regret or pain, but rather looking on that beautiful moment, not mourning it, but gaining experience from it. And if you don't know what I say about gaining experience, well, in the words of Hideki Kamiya, ask your mom. I have more videos to make. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider liking it, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe. Then click on that little bell notification to subscribe again, I guess. I upload at most 2 videos per month, so you don't really have to worry about notification spam. Also, if you're able, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If I can be honest, these videos take a long time to research and create to be as in-depth as I can possibly make them. And trust me, that doesn't do me any favors with YouTube algorithms or exposure. Your support keeps the channel going, and I couldn't do this without the support of these wonderful people. Or if you want to support the channel and charity and get games while you're at it, you can use my Humble Bundle partner link below. Until next time, this is SoberDwarf reminding you that gaining experience builds character.